Welcome to Chandwell. My name's Michael, and after a short break I'm beginning construction of a commercial street for the front of my N-gauge layout. I'm starting with a curved fronted hotel based on the Crescent Hotel in Ilkley. I've completed the mock-up and I'm ready to start building the hotel for real. I'm starting this build by getting the footprint of the hotel exactly right. And to do this, I use the free drawing application Inkscape. In this episode, I will explain the process I went through to take the hotel in Ilkley and bend it to the right shape for its location at the corner of Station Road and High Street in Chandwell. I start in Google Earth. The hotel in Ilkley bends almost 90 degrees from Brook Street onto Leeds Road. The curved section seems like a regular circle. To try and work out its radius, I use the measurement tool in Google Maps. It's difficult to tell exactly, but I'm going to go with 22 metres. It's much simpler to measure the depth of the building itself. It's about 14 metres. This gives me almost everything I need, but there is one more detail I need to be mindful of. The centre section of wall seems to be recessed slightly behind the rest of the building's face. I didn't measure this in person, but let's say a couple of feet, about 0.6 of a metre, or 4 millimetres in N-gauge. So that's Ilkley, but what about Chandwell? I used a couple of rulers to represent High Street and Station Road. Using a protractor, I measured this angle here as 118 degrees. This is the amount of curvature I need to add to the hotel. Let's move to Inkscape. I decided to start with the curved part of the hotel. I drew a rectangle. By holding down Ctrl as I drag, I know it's a perfect square. I make this exactly 149mm on each side. This represents the 22 metre radius of the real hotel's circle. With snapping turned on and with Shift and Ctrl held down, I drag a circle from the top right to the bottom left of the square. This creates a perfect circle of the correct radius for our hotel. This will be the hotel's outer edge. I duplicate the square and make it a darker colour. I make this one 95mm on each edge. That's the 14 metre depth of the hotel. I position this above the first square. I duplicate the first circle and make it a darker colour. Then I simply drag the corner with Shift and Ctrl held down to keep it centred and in proportion. This snaps to the second square and represents the inside edge of the hotel. It will be useful during construction to know where the centre line of the hotel is, so I duplicate the square, make it half size by dividing 95 by 2, and repeat the previous steps. And finally the centre recess. I repeat the whole process using a tiny 4mm square. I'm left with 4 concentric circles representing the essential parts of the hotel's dimensions. Next we need to remove the bits that we don't need. We don't need 3/4 of the circles. I draw a couple of large rectangles over the parts I don't need. I merge these into one shape using the union function, and then I repeatedly duplicate them and use them to remove the sections of circle underneath by using the difference function. This leaves me with a quarter circle which is starting to look a little like the crescent in Ilkley. I duplicate and use the smallest quarter to cut out the inner part from the 3 larger segments, and then delete it. This leaves me with the basic shape of the hotel's floor plan. In Chandwell, the hotel will not curve 90 degrees. The angle we measured, 118 degrees, means that the hotel curves only 62 degrees, so we need to cut down the circle even further. I draw a simple horizontal line, and then using the transform tool, I rotate the line 118 degrees. This is the angle of High Street against Station Road. I draw another line, and as I drag it toward the first, Inkscape snaps it in place perpendicular to the first line. I can then drag this line to the corner of my guide square, which is the centre of the hotel's circle. And there I have the edge of the hotel. To later get the recess right, I need a few more guidelines. I draw a new perpendicular line against the first guide, and then snap this into position as a tangent to the circle. I then drop in some rectangles to represent the outer edges of the circle segment. These help me snap guides to the right locations. A line from the circle's centre to the intersection of High Street and Station Road gives me the centre of the curve. This is where the door will be. I use the 62-degree guideline and the division function to cut the circle segments along the line. I can then just delete the unwanted parts. So what about the recessed part of the building? I've already drawn out the front of the building separately. By drawing a rectangle under the recessed part, we can see that it is 46.325mm wide. Let's get back to our circles. I copy and paste the rectangle I've just drawn and drop it under the circles. I draw another guideline perpendicular to the centre line I drew earlier, and then drag this into place as a tangent to the circle. I can then simply drag the rectangle using snapping and rotate it until it snaps to the line. Using snapping again, I then drop the rectangle so its centre lines up with the inside of the inner circle's centre guideline. I can then draw two further lines, one from each corner of the rectangle to the circle's centre point. This gives me the wedge shape that represents the inset part of the building's front. Obviously there is a curve involved here, so the resulting width of the wedge will be slightly different to what we measured on the building's drawing. We can check this using the Measure Path tool. It's 46.57mm instead of 46.33. It's just 1/4 of a millimetre out, and I can certainly live with that. Finally, I use the guidelines and the difference function to chop the circle segments into separate shapes, and then deleted the outer edge of the middle segment. I used the Measure Path function to measure the length of the arc of the building's front, 161.15mm. The front of the hotel is going to be longer than that. I'd already drawn the frontage based on the elevations of the real thing that I downloaded from the Bradford Council planning portal. It's 268.69mm long. I drew a rectangle 161.15mm wide and aligned it centred on the hotel's doorway. Just like the real thing, the hotel is longer on one side than the other. With the red rectangle in place, I drew two further rectangles with snapping on so that they filled the remaining space. I copied and pasted these onto my footprint drawing. I used the measure tool to double check the width of half of the building, 47.5mm. I then adjusted the height of the blue rectangles to be exactly this high. We now have rectangles that are the correct width and are half the height of the building's depth. Changing the colour to green, I created a duplicate of the longer one and dropped it to the side of the curved section. And I did the same for the shorter one. I lined its bottom corner and then rotated it until it snapped to the curved part. I repeated this with two more identical but darker coloured rectangles. The shape of the hotel is now beginning to show. It was a simple job of combining the shapes into three separate sections using the union function. I'm probably going to build each section as a separate wedge-shaped building, which I'll glue together to complete the final hotel. But for now, I just made it into a simple outline, which I can print onto copier paper. Before we look at that, it's worth pointing out that at every step of the drawing, I duplicated the shapes and did the next step on a new copy. This means that should I notice any mistakes, I can quickly get back to the right place to fix them. Also, keeping the outlines and guides will help when it comes to building the portico and other elements of the hotel. I printed the shape onto paper and cut it out with scissors. On the layout, it looks exactly right. The angles all line up, and the building is going to line up properly along High Street. It looks right compared to the flat mock-up I made previously. I am ready to make a start. I spent 2 hours on this little process, which takes the total build time to 8 hours. I used 2 sheets of A4 copier paper. Welcome to our new channel members, and a special thank you to new Chandwell business owners Ian and Gary. It's nice to have you in Chandwell. Thank you for your support. If you missed last time's video where I share my vision for this part of the layout, then you can take a look here. If you'd like more information about what being a channel member is, then you can use this button here. I'm looking forward to sharing the actual building of the hotel with you. So until then, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.